All right. Um, Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon. Salaam alaikum. Good evening, wherever you are in the world watching us. My name is Ermin Sinanovic. I am Executive Director of the Center for Islam in the Contemporary World at Shenandoah University in Virginia. And I will be your host. This is our, I believe, fifth in the series of our CICW talks. And we are honored to have with us today Dr. Chiara Formichi, who is Associate Professor of Asian Studies at Cornell University. And today we are discussing her latest book, which is Islam and Asia, A History. It's a book that was published by Cambridge University Press. And obviously it's a great book, otherwise we wouldn't be talking about it. So Chiara, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. I guess this is the silver lining of the pandemic, of being able to do this from far away and having such a broad audience. So thanks for having me.
Oh, of course, you're most welcome. So just as a point of introduction, I would like to invite you to check out our website, contemporaryislam.org, and learn more about what our center does. This book particularly, I think, is interesting to me personally, not only because it's about Islam and Asia, which is, a focus of my own personal study of Islam as well, but also because of its approach, and we will come to that. But I will mention something here. In the announcements about the book, I put Islam in Asia, a history. And then I noticed this morning that I made a mistake. And I was like, that's exactly what I'm talking and arguing against at the same time. And at the same time, I'm so conditioned and I'm making that mistake. So let's start with this, Chiara, which is the question that I ask everybody of. Why did you write the book and what is its main argument?
Sure, but before I go into that, I want to address what you said. Your conditioned mistake.
Yeah.
And the original title, or the working title of the book, as the editor and I worked on it, was Islam in Asia. That was the idea all along. But then you hit this realization, which is that's exactly the problem. This is not about Islam as it's practiced, and I'm using a lot of air quotes here, but how is this practiced in Asia, because it's different from Islam anywhere else. But really is the idea of connecting Islam and Asia as two bodies and subject of study that so often are not connected. So I come from a background in Islamic studies, having spent a lot of my life in Indonesia. And so when I went to grad school, I started bringing together Islamic studies, a so-called proper training in Islamic studies, having done Arabic and Persian, and having studied, grammatical texts in the good old European continental tradition, the way that we study Arabic and Islamic studies, with the study of Asia. And it was so hard to find conversation partners that would take me seriously on each side. And so that's really where the book came from. This frustration as a student, as a researcher, and ultimately as a teacher, as a professor, in bringing Islam and Asia as two non-incommensurate subjects of study or objects of study. And that's where the book came from. So when I decided to start working on Islam in Southeast Asia, my professors were like, oh, that's a great idea, but you're your own, go and do it, as an honors thesis in my undergraduate. And then I moved on to grad school and started researching more in depth. So moving from Italy to the UK, and I had amazing professors there. But again, every time I was focusing, my first book is focused on political Islam and the idea of in practice of an Islamic state in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia specifically. And, all the discourses and all the academic scholarship on political Islam and Islamic statehood are really focused on the Middle East. And with Pakistan sometimes surfacing for the 20th century, but Indonesia is never part of the conversation. So that for me was a really important point. And then moving on as a professor, not having the the material to assign to my classes, and always having students say, oh, but these readings are so hard and so niche. Where is the bigger picture? And so when I approached writing this book, the idea was to, yes, being able to reach a broad audience, but also to make an impact in scholarship and kind of trying to give a new framing, or a framing, in fact, to focus and to talk about Islam in Asia. So maybe he's overambitious in that way of making it approachable to the broad audience, as well as to scholars who focus on these two supposedly separate subjects. But to go to your question, which was very kind, which is, what is the main argument, right? We're all good at talking
Sure.
in broad strokes. And so Islam and Asia, you see, I am myself conditioned that
exactly.
way. Wants to kind of tries, and I do with the book, to advance this idea that Islam, that we need to understand Islam, and we need to talk about Islam if we want to understand Asia, and not just to understand those areas of Asia that are Muslim majority, but also to understand China. And, you know, the cover of the book that you, again, candidly showed, this is a Chinese plate, which is blue and white and is traditionally thought of as Ming, imperial China. But in fact, the whole history of the blue and white comes from the Middle East, comes from Muslim traders. And that's the kind of interweaving that I'm really going for, that we need Islam to understand Asia, and we need Asia to understand Islam. And I do this in a variety of ways that I think we might go into later on.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much. That's a great kind of foundation for our discussion. I think the fact that both you and I studied Southeast Asia, you spent a lot of time in Indonesia, but also in other Southeast Asian countries. I spent a lot of time in Malaysia. And you remind me of this plate. If you go to that, I think it's Museum of Asian Civilization Museum in Singapore, right? You get a whole story about these things, you know, how it developed and the demand that came from the Middle East and the export of this type of material, you know, to the Middle East from China, and the connections then that Southeast Asia emerges, like I always say, not as a peripheral, you know, part of the story of Islam. It actually is quite central. And so this brings me to the second question that I have for you, this whole idea of periphery, right, of the periphery. In our center, we have something that we are developing. We call it Islam on the Edges. And actually, the idea came originally, remember that program at Chicago that you and I were at in, I think it was 2012?
It was a long time ago.
It was a long time ago, yeah. And I think we were teaching, we were talking about Islam at the edges, about Islam in Southeast Europe, Southeast Asia. There were school teachers, and we were like called to talk to them and so on. And from then on, that idea, you know, kept germinating in my mind. So in many ways, your book utilizes this similar approach, which is to try to do away with this whole center-periphery idea. So can you tell us more about Islam on the periphery? You write about that in the book, about trans-regionalism, which you also talk about. And why are these so important?
Thank you. I mean, that's the whole point, right? Is the fact that we're so ingrained into thinking about a center of Islam, and the moment in which you have a center, you inevitably have peripheries. And I think as a caveat, I want to say that I'm not, what's the term? I'm not refusing or refuting the fact that there is a devotional and historical center of Islam. Mecca and Medina are obviously extremely important in the way in which Islamic forms of devotion have emerged and are constructed and continue to be performed. But then it doesn't mean that when we talk about Islam as a you know, centuries old phenomenon, we have to remain harnessed to this idea of a center and therefore of peripheries, which is extremely problematic, I think, in many, many ways. But first, I'm going to talk a little bit about the book, and then I'm going to go back at why I think it's so important. It's, you know, in the book, I struggled between wanting to think about Asia as incorporating West Asia, so Arabia being part of Asia in that sense, so being part of the narrative, but also not wanting this to then make it again about derivation and deviation from an orthodoxy or from a practice that developed in a certain space. And so I think that cognitively there are a number of things that we struggle with in a moment in which we try to de-harness ourselves from the narrative of center and periphery. But the trans-regionalism and connections, it's what I found extremely liberating. And so in the moment in which we stop thinking about individual places, but actually we think about the trajectories that connect these multiple locales where Muslims are and have been for centuries, then to me was extremely liberating. Whether we are talking about the trade of plates and ceramics, whether we talk about the history of slavery and enslavement, whether we are talking about scholars and pilgrims, and all these ways in which humans have moved along certain trajectories across Asia, and of course, well beyond it, and have carried Islam as Muslims traveled. And so what kind of conversations took place? And so these are kind of the things that I try to weave through the book. This idea of connections that bring together the Mediterranean to the Pacific. And then, of course, I acknowledge that there are many other connections well beyond the Asian space, but that's the focus of my book. I can't be too ambitious that way. And so connecting the Mediterranean with the Pacific, and then thinking about the conversations between trans-regional and global or global phenomenon and local phenomenon, again, a lot of air quotes in there, and reflecting on how pre-Islamic and Islamic ideas, rituals, laws, literature, all of this, how it emerged and how it took shape and changes through time. And so why I think that this is important. I really like that point of reflection. It makes me think more of what is at stake here besides an academic dispute or the way in which we think about Islam as academics. And what really comes to mind to me when I think about its importance is that when we endorse the fact, or we accept the fact that there is a center and there are peripheries, we inevitably end up endorsing and legitimizing efforts from the center to make their worldview the only right one, the only truth one. But also we erase the historical trajectory that made that one center-based practice what we see today, because if we need to take it as an orthodoxy and an orthopraxy, the history behind it disappears. And so this is, for me, part of the work was to, for my own sake, and what I do also in the classroom and in the book, is to flesh out how what we consider orthodoxy today, of course, is the outcome of a historical trajectory. And for me, I was thinking along and with Ahmad Shahab was really important, that before orthodoxy kind of work that he did. It's in that sense is really enlightening. And the erasure, of course, the erosion and erasure of historical trajectory doesn't happen just at the center, but then also happens at the so-called peripheries. We just have this flattening. In the moment in which we accept center and periphery, we just flatten the whole religious devotional experience, which I think is extremely dangerous, not just for the sake of individuals, but also for politics and for the way in which we talk about Islam today. I couldn't go on and on. I mean, this is this is Orientalist, this endorses racial hierarchies. It does all sorts of things that we don't want to perpetuate.
Yeah. And I think, your book, and the readers will see that your book does a great job in being so nuanced to present these cases. What I like especially about the book, if I could just plug it in here before we continue, is that it is written with real scholarly rigor. In other words, it is obviously well-researched, somebody who is writing well from the position of knowledge and so on, but it is also written like a textbook. So it can be easily used in both undergraduate and graduate classes, I think. And I think this is the strength of the book. It could be read by a general reader who wants to learn about Islam and Asia. It can be read by a learned reader, and it can be read by the students. And that's a very difficult, I think, balance to achieve. And I think you achieved that in the book, which is quite extraordinary feat. So I will allow you to elaborate just a little bit on what you just said. I love how your first chapter sets the stage by giving us a Pan-Asian or inter-Asian perspective. You talk about inter-Asian connections. So before I ask you to elaborate, I'll just share something that I always mention when I talk about this. I remember when I used to live in Malaysia, and I would watch the news, and they would say, and now the news from West Asia. And I'll be like, where in the world is West Asia? And it is what we call the Middle East, right? And so the geography immediately is destabilized. The geography is immediately reshaped, right? So if you look at Asia as a contiguous place, which obviously it was, and I think the divisions that we have today in Middle East, Southeast Asia, South Asia, are Cold War divisions. That Cold War is not with us any longer, yet the geography that we use, even in our academic work, is still informed by the Cold War. And I think, if to be honest, China has been actually much better in recognizing that the whole Belt and Road Initiative is about connecting whole Asia. So their geography is so different from geography that we have in the West. And I think geopolitically, the West is now suffering because of that. So please tell us a little bit more about these inter-Asian, pan-Asian perspectives and connections.
Oh, thank you. First of all, thank you for your very kind words on the narrative. It was really not easy, and there were many drafts of the book that enjoyed and benefited from feedback from very close friends and colleagues and mentors. But that was really what I was striving for. What I strive for is to have a book that can be used in the classroom by undergraduates and graduate students, but also that a colleague of mine, a peer, could pick up and read and feel that they are learning something. So just to connecting back to your question, is not about, the book relies heavily on already published and available scholarship. There is some of my original research in there, but really it's an approach book in that sense of looking at what we have and what could we make of it in a bigger picture. And that's where the intra-Asia connections come through. To interweave a few points there. My mind has definitely been framed by European scholarship, but also by having spent a lot of my time in Asia. And so I did my postdoc in Singapore. I had my first tenure track job in Hong Kong. And definitely when you place yourself in Asia, you start realizing even more so that the whole Middle East, Near East paradigm doesn't make any sense, right? If I, in Hong Kong and my students, I would say, oh, in the Middle East, they would be like, well, middle of what?
Yep.
And that's
exactly. East to what, right? For
exactly.
them, it's the West.
Yeah. So that for me was very important, just as embodying this connection, but also in Singapore, at ARI and other, NUS more broadly, there's been this push for intra-Asia connections for a very long time. I was fortunate to be there when Prasenjit Duara was director, and this reassessing, recentering the study of Asia in Asia. And the work of En Sang Ho and Ronnie Ritchie, as different as they are, for me have been extremely influential in, again, shifting and moving the center of the map away from Europe and in Asia in that sense. And I wanted to weave this narrative where you can see the ways in which Muslims moved across Asia in various ways, embodying different figures and different roles, and then contributing to the emergence of Muslim communities and ways of being Muslim. And by saying different ways to be Muslim or to express being Muslim, I don't mean it from a Girsian syncretic point of view at all. This is everything that I fight against in the class and in all my classes and all my work, but really as this idea of a conversation and taking it, again, an Asian perspective really helps, because once we start looking at the history of Islam across Asia, we understand why Xinjiang is such a contested territory, and the cultural legacy in Xinjiang is so contested, because historically people in the Tarim Basin would have looked much more to Persia and Turkic communities than to the Han communities and to Han culture of the East. In the same way, when we think about Southeast Asia and the demographics of Muslims across Southeast Asia, if you take the Mekong Delta between Vietnam and Cambodia, we have this very small community of Cham Muslims.
Yes.
And, when I ask students in the class, it's like, why are there Muslims? There was like, oh, this is so weird. It's like, why would there be such a small community there? It feels so isolated. It's like, well, if you look before colonialism and then post-colonial boundaries, you shouldn't have been looking at land, but instead you look at the water and see how the Cham community was very closely connected to Muslims in Java, the Malay Peninsula, Borneo, Southern Philippines. And so there you had a majority, you had a Muslim space. And so this idea of an Islamized space of interaction across Asia is what I'm trying to do. And I think it really helps to, I like the term unhinge, even though I know it means going crazy, but really to unhook that connection that we had between Islam, Orthodoxy, Arab versus Islam, Asia, deviation and syncretism, and something that is exotic and different in that way.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I like the point that you made about look at the water. That's one of the first moves that I always do when I teach about Southeast Asia or, the Asian Muslim communities. I basically put the Indian Ocean at the center. And then I start looking out from there. I say, look, if you put the Indian Ocean at the center, it all now makes sense. It's all interconnected. You start discovering the trade routes, start discovering the movement of the people. Just looking by land doesn't really give you much. But let's go to the land and connect it to the water. You talk about the spread of Islam in Asia. And of course, much of the work and a lot of talk had been about, and even in classical Muslim scholarship, about ma wara an-nahr, right? The lands behind the river. What's behind the river, of course, is the Oxus or Amu Darya, the Transoxian and so on and so forth. We find that, in Hudsonian legacy as well, the venture of Islam and so on. Yeah. So how did Islam spread in Asia? Actually, I know it's a huge thing, but just give us a couple of minutes of that. Of course, you have a whole chapter in your book. And what are some of the defining features of this phenomenon?
Yeah, that was a nightmare of a chapter to write. I damned myself, but I also thought it was really important to kind of draw these connections. And the way that I usually kind of boil it down to make it more immediately understandable, also visualizable. I'm slightly dyslexic, so for me, sometimes a lot of words just make things a lot worse. And so going back to the map, I think about these 4 trajectories that brought Islam out of Arabia. And the first one is the one that we're most commonly acquainted with, which is really Ibn Qasim's expedition to Sind. And so we have this the first image of, an army of Muslims, which of course they were not all Muslims, it was only the higher, the generals who were Muslims, but, the Arab army going into India and arriving there, of course, stopping early 8th century. But then we have around the 11th century, we have these waves of former slave soldiers of Turkic descent who were in power in Central Asia and then start descending down on North India. And so we have a first trajectory in the 8th century, and then we have another trajectory north-south in the around 11th century, and of course is a long period. Then we have the traders, as you were mentioning, who were operating along the Indian Ocean. And connected Arabia and the Yemen with the coastal areas of the Indian subcontinent, and then moved on to Southeast Asia, but then, which is often forgotten, moved further on to coastal China. And so we have this kind of really three-part movement across water that embraces Asia as a continent. And then the fourth trajectory is purely continental then way, and is again traders who operated along the Silk Road routes, because there were multiple of them, and connected the Mediterranean with probably the Pacific, if not really on the coast of China, but definitely up to Xi'an, through Central Asia and the West and the Tarim Basin. And so we have these four trajectories that really show us how Islam came at different times through different individuals, different waves, but then also Muslims were returning back, right? So it's not an only West to East Asia movement, but it's also a movement East to West, with traders coming back, new or old converts wanting to study in the Middle East, pilgrims. And then let's not forget that some of these scholars, students, pilgrims would become important teachers in the Middle East. And so it's not just knowledge or religion emanating again from a center onto the periphery, but there is also this backward movement, which is, return movement in a way that becomes extremely important to shape the way that we think and talk about Islam today.
Yeah, it's almost like you're reading lines of one of my unpublished papers now. I know that Michael Finneer, he has, in one of the books, he talks about these teachers from the Malay world who settled in Mecca and Medina and became very prominent teachers, So it wasn't just one-way street, so to say. People from today's Malaysia, Indonesia, Brunei, Philippines, wherever, they go to Mecca or Medina or Cairo, they learn Islam, then they go back to their communities and teach. Yeah. Oftentimes they settle in Mecca and Medina and Cairo and become prominent scholars in their own right, teaching in Arabic, teaching everybody, not just people from their own regions. And I think this is, again, important to understand, to kind of go against this notion of one-way movement, or they're coming to the source to take the real Islam and taking it back home, and so on. In one of my own understandings, I understand Islam in, say, Malaysia, Indonesia, to be as orthodox and as mainstream as any Islam anywhere in the world. Actually, it's interesting because oftentimes when I used to live in Malaysia, I would hear the Arabs saying, these people here, they take Islam too seriously. So they would actually say that the people in Malaysia were actually much more committed in some ways than people in their own Arab countries they were coming from. And that is so interesting. And you only get that if you have lived experience, right? If you actually experience that.
Sorry, if I may jump in for a minute.
Sure, go ahead, please.
So the work that you mentioned by Michael Finneer, of course, Michael is one of, he hired me, was my first job in Singapore as a postdoc, was with him, and
yeah, he was there at that time, yeah.
Has very deeply influenced my work, and his feedback on the book also is quite prominent. But the scholars that you talk about, I actually open my chapter 3, which is on networks and renewal, with some translated work that he did with Mike Laffin, and it's really about this Jawi from the 13th century who lived in Aden, but his name, and we don't know whether he was born in Southeast Asia or whether he was a trader or whatever. But the important thing is that his name, his nisba was Al-Jawi. And so he clearly makes this connection. He was considered a very important teacher, both as a muhaddith, so both as a scholar of the law and as a Sufi. And so to me, he's so important because he embodies not just the importance of individuals who see themselves connected to Asia as well as to Arabia, but also embodies these two characteristic of Islamic scholarship that are the so-called spiritual path and legal path, which we are so trained again to think about as separate things. Instead, they're really not one and the same, but they come hand in hand and they have been together for a long time.
Absolutely, and you're anticipating my next question, actually. That exactly is what my next question is about. So you write in one of your chapters about Tariqa and Sharia, right? The Sufi and legal approaches. And in a lot of scholarship and a lot of kind of popular understanding of Islam, these are juxtaposed against one another. So they're understood to be exclusive from one another. If you're a mystic and a Sufi, then you cannot be a legalist. If you're a legalist, you cannot be a mystic. But in your book, you weave the narrative that that shows that these two approaches to Islam have always been complementary, and that is true in Asia. So can you tell us more about this?
Yeah, sure. And what Masood Al-Jawi, who I was just mentioning, is one of those figures that I use in the book to kind of tell the story. But I think that the case study that makes the strongest argument in favor of this combination, rather juxtaposition of Tariqa and Sharia is the Naqshbandiya. Right. And to me, the Naqshbandiya, and to the book, the Naqshbandiya does so much because it's a thoroughly Asian tariqa, right? Emerges early 13th, 14th century in Central Asia, has a very important life in South Asia and the rest of Central Asia, but then it becomes a global phenomenon. It arrives to Damascus, where we have important shrines.
It arrives to Bosnia.
To Bosnia, absolutely, right? So Eastern Europe through the Ottoman connection, but it also arrives in China and throughout China and Southeast Asia, and is important also in Arabia, mostly in Medina, but also in Mecca, right? And so it's this importance of Asia, so-called Asian phenomenons, to understand Islam more broadly. But it also does a lot more, right? Because the Naqshbandiya is concerned, emerges as a school that is concerned with lasciviousness and with the way in which Islam is getting co-opted by politicians and by how it's no longer pure, is no longer what it used to be and what it's supposed to be. And again, it's not Cairo's reformism, it's not Wahhabism. It's really an Asian phenomenon that comes way before the historical nodes and historical moments that we usually associate with reformism and purification of religious practices.
Would you say, if I could just quickly, would you say that Jadidism in Central Asia is connected to it?
Yes, is connected in terms of, again, not necessarily in terms of genealogies, of intellectual and religious genealogies, but definitely intellectually and in terms of concerns and ways of addressing. And I think that, Al-Qarsawi was a crucial individual in the Jadid movement, an early Jadid movement, and was also acquainted with the Naqshbandi school. So we have individuals who kind of overlap networks in that way. And so, again, the Naqshbandiya allows us to see all these counterintuitive phenomenons, Asia being important to Islam in general, the very disciplined Sufi, very committed Sufi spiritual school that is as concerned with the word and the example of Muhammad, right? And so that's what was also really, in a way, fun and definitely interesting to flesh out, was the importance of the muhaddis, of the transmitters and the scholars of hadith, as being this link between Sufism and legalism, because the hadith is crucial to developing Islamic law, but is also crucial to Sufi practitioners to have a model of behavior. And so it's not just in practice, but it's also in the way in which scholarship is constructed, Islamic scholarship is constructed, that we see the connections between Sufism and legalism. The last bit of that I find, that I found extremely important to delve into, again, thinking about Sufism and how, why, again, going back to your original question of why are some things important, why is it important to think about the connection between Sufism and legalism? Much of this Orientalist, colonial scholarship on Islam in Asia from Central Asia East was that Sufism and Sufis had been the mechanism through which individuals had been converted to Islam because of this supposed similarity between Sufi spiritualism and Hindu, Buddhist, shamanic traditions. And so it was easy for Asian individuals to convert to Islam because it wasn't so different. It wasn't about praying 5 times a day. It wasn't about not eating pork or not drinking alcohol, but rather was just about having a direct individual connection with God through these clear steps, which really remind of some Hindu and Buddhist tradition. And of course, this is so laden with conversations about little and big tradition and Orientalist exoticizations of Asia. And so to me, to bring back Sufism and legalism, or, what we would today talk about as orthodox fundamentalist in the sense of going back to the scripture practices, was really important to underscore and to undermine the conversation over Islam in Asia is just superficial Islam, is not really about being Muslim as the Western world thinks about being Muslim.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think, and you do such a good job in the book explaining this, and I think anybody who reads it will come out from reading it much richer in their understanding. I would also like to remind our audience that our chat function is available on YouTube, so if you have any comments or questions, please feel free to do so, to ask. I would like to ask you to maybe just identify yourself with your name and country so that we can refer to you when we're selecting and choosing questions. But I do have a few more of my own. And in chapters 4 and 5, you show how Pan-Islamism and nationalism contributed to anti-colonial struggles. While this is not necessarily new, what is refreshing in your book is that you show very strong inter-Asian connections. In other words, your book expands our map from being focused on the Middle East. So when people talk about Pan-Islamism, it's usually, Abduhu, Rida, the Muslim Brothers, all of that, right? So you expand it from that to including South and Southeast Asia in this narrative. Now, why is this perspective so important, and what can we learn by looking at this history of Pan-Islamism and nationalism in that way?
Yeah, this is another great question. And it's a great way to bring a number of chapters together also. That was definitely one of the things I was trying to do, was really to turn around conversations on Pan-Islamism around on their head, right? So we usually think about Pan-Islamism and Islamism per se, but also Pan-Islamism as this phenomena that emerges from a center, whether it was the Ottoman Caliphate or the Muslim Brotherhood. But, yes, Istanbul had its own reasons for rallying so-called peripheral Muslims in 1914 with a jihad fatwa. But much of the energy, in my analysis of things, much of the energy towards the post-Ottoman Caliphate came from Asia and as far east as Japan, in fact, right? So the center did have its own interests, but then they get completely derailed and take a life of their own. And similar with the Muslim Brotherhood, sure, Muslim Brotherhood emerges in Egypt, but when it arrives, or when it emerges in Central Asia and in Malaysia, most importantly, it really is its own thing. It's not a photocopy, and it's not even a blurred photocopy. It's just another painting, right? I mean, that's the thing, that Pan-Islamism, this idea of Muslim solidarity, is not something that comes necessarily from the center being projected out, or in which people at the peripheries are asking for help, support, or looking up to Arabia or the Ottoman Empire, but rather a process through which Muslims the world over feel that they are part of their ummah, and being part of the Ummah puts everybody on one level, on the same plane, and individuals can and groups can contribute in their own ways. And I think that this is also really important, not just in historical terms, but also in more recent historical times when, for example, we think about 21st century, early 21st century narratives on Islamic terrorism in Southeast Asia, and thinking of that as the long hand of Al-Qaeda in Southeast Asia, where local Muslims are just puppets of Al-Qaeda. In fact, there is, and by this I'm not saying, Southeast Asian Muslims are terrorists, but I'm saying that they had long established historical reasons for protesting and showing their discontent towards the nation state for a very long time. And so it's, again, we shouldn't think of that as a multi-level marketing pyramid, but rather we should think of it as a co-op in which everybody has their share, and there is something to partake into intellectually as much as logistically in that sense. I hope this makes sense. The metaphor was a little far off, but yeah.
No, it's all good. And it does show these connections, which I, in my own research, have found to be very important. I also like that part of the book where you mentioned the jihad fatwa in Istanbul, still it was the Ottoman, right? The Ottomans. And I like those really terse, short answers. Would it be? And then the question goes, and it says, yes, it would. There is no legal justification. It just says, yes, it would. Would it be this and this? Yes, it would. And I would like the readers to look at that. It is really fascinating. A lot of actually fatwa from that period are that way. The question would be, is it allowed to do this, 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 and this? And the answer is, yes, it is. And that's it. There is no legal justification. Of course, in their own writings, the muftis would write oftentimes legal justification for these things, but in the responses to the community, to the wider population, it would often be just yes, no, it would, it wouldn't, it will, it won't, this kind of thing. And it's just very instructive. When you read that, it's like, what's going on here? Why is the answer so short? Because nowadays people are, okay, but what is your evidence? What do you base it on? But back then, people really didn't add. They had, for the most part, a lot of people had faith in their own institutions and their own muftis. And if the mufti says, yes, this is allowed, they would just go out and do it. They don't ask, as a lot of Muslims today you often find would be, yeah, but what is the reasoning? And here's the link where I found this and that. It just shows how this discourse existed 100 years ago. And I think your book captures that as well. And it's very, very good to have that.
Thank you. I also think that is a way in which religious authority was constructed, right? So in a moment in which the Ottoman Empire, which of course was a caliphate, issues a fatwa, it probably didn't feel that it have to elaborate on why that was the answer. Of course, we also know that much of the answer was political. So, who knows how they constructed. I mean, I'm sure that someone was very convinced of the answer. I'm not saying that it was fake news in that sense, but the message, they wanted to send a very clear, specific message, and they didn't feel that they had to couch it, that they didn't have to provide all the explanations, because ultimately they had the authority of being the caliphate.
All right, I have to unmute myself. Sometimes we all forget that. So we're starting to getting questions from the audience, but I have just one more question. So let's try and finish that and then move on to questions and comments from the audience. So the last 3 chapters of your book connect Islamic revival with resistance and reimagining of Islamic authority, especially women's religious authority and leadership. And then you give examples from Indonesia and Malaysia. Would you tell us more about this, about Islam as resistance, reimagining religious authority, and especially the role of women in this new authority in Asia?
Yeah, maybe I'll just focus on the last part of the question, because otherwise I'm afraid I'm going to talk for too long. And I'm very curious to hear questions, and we can circle back to aspects of resistance and reimagination of piety there. But, for me to read the very last chapter, which is on religious authority, was, technically it's not it's the last substantive chapter before the conclusion, was exhilarating in a way. It was challenging, but, I worked through making sure that women's voices and women's actions were present throughout the book. But I felt that the last chapter was where women really came to the surface as the main game changers or pathfinders. I think that's the term that I use in the book. So both, and to me, this was exhilarating because it also brought up Southeast Asia. And I'm going to put a disclaimer right out here, which is, I am a Southeast Asianist. I spent most of the past 35 years, a big chunk of the past 35 years in Southeast Asia, studying Islam. But I really think that I'm not so biased. I've done my due diligence, and I feel that the way that I'm seeing things is not necessarily how I am seeing it, but there might be something there. And what is it that I'm referring to? My bottom line in that chapter is that there have been some specific historical political developments, specifically in Indonesia and Malaysia, that range from state director development to a public commitment to let's say, an investment friendly form of Islam. And a fostering of private expressions of Islam. So couching Islam in very specific spaces, not suppressing it, but limiting it and allowing it to thrive in specific contexts. That combined with a history of women agency, in the sense that in Southeast Asia, we're all fairly familiar with this paradigm of women being very present in the public dominion, right? Being present as, in Patani and Aceh, we know historically that where women sultanas, we know that in everyday life, women were present in the market as sellers and buyers, right? I'm not depicting a rosy picture of women's status in Southeast Asia, but it's definitely different from other geographical, sociological contexts across the so-called Muslim world, or the world in general. And so the combination of these factors has brought me to think about women in Southeast Asia, or specifically in Indonesia and Malaysia, in the last 35, 40 years as having been able to carve a niche for themselves as interpreters of the scriptures. And this is something that, again, historically, we see women being really important in the very early days before the Abbasids, having a space, a place, and a voice in the public sphere in terms of religious authority, but then this disappears. And I'm seeing Indonesia and Malaysia as a place where these voices are coming back. And again, not to make one argument or what's the expression is not to bring necessarily Indonesia and Malaysia together, because they're very different countries in their experiences. I see that whereas both in Indonesia and Malaysia, we see women speaking out for themselves and organize themselves as interpreters. In Malaysia, they're being criticized by government affiliate religious groups, because they argue that these women have mostly secular education, they are not trained in the traditional Islamic sciences. Whereas in Indonesia, because of different education policies, we see that these women are coming out from the pesantren background. They're coming out through the pipeline of religious education. And so they read Arabic, they are trained in tafsir, and they are being recognized by the Ministry of Religious Affairs as having a voice that needs to be heard and needs to be listened to. And I'm seeing these emerging really only in Southeast Asia. In that sense, Indonesia is at the forefront. I don't know what the impact is going to be long term, but I'm definitely seeing Southeast Asia emerging as a place for women's voices, halal certification, for example, fashion industry, kind of a new frontier in that sense of religious authority making and assertion. And to me, that was a really nice way to conclude the book as a Southeast Asian. So through the book, kind of has this split personality between reading about Central Asia and things that I knew very little about, South Asia, China and Japan, but then also being able to kind of bring back the point home where I really know my stuff more deeply, and feeling that some of these things are really coming together, and was it was exhilarating. This is the best adjective, I think, for that last section of the book.
Yeah, definitely, and it shows your obviously the deep familiarity with the region shows in those chapters and the last parts of the book, and I think it is really good to finish the book on that kind of high note, in a way, and I think for the right reasons too. I mean, the concentration of Muslims in Asia, other than the Indo-Pakistani sort of subcontinent, is greatest in Southeast Asia in many ways, but is often overlooked and often left out from the conversation. So,
I just wanted to jump in with one thing, which is I always try to keep the demographic argument, marginalized, but ultimately 60% of the Muslim population lives in Asia, and 25% of the world Muslim population lives in Southeast Asia. Indonesia is the largest Muslim country in the world, right? I mean, we have all these numbers, but then they seem to never kind of brought the point home, but they're definitely important.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, thank you so much. We have a question from Rushda from India. She asked, Dr. Formichi, your canvas is very wide. Is it possible for you to comment on the creation of Pakistan in shaping how the society developed in the rest of Asia? So maybe to kind of think about this is, to what extent creation of the state of Pakistan, post-World War II, had influenced development of Islam in Asia in general?
That's a great question, and I think that the creation of Pakistan had really important and major ripple effects in Muslims' imaginations of what the post-colonial post-colonial reality and political reality could be. But it's also important to remember that secularism was extremely important, both in the conception of Pakistan as well as in conceptions of the post-colonial, right? So the Bandung Conference in the mid-50s was important in bringing together leaders of the newly independent countries that many of them were Muslim majority countries, and yet Islam played such a minimal, if any, role at all, right? So to me, again, thinking about the book and challenges was really hard to frame the chapter on the post-colonial period, on the early first post-colonial decade. How was Islam important? How was Islam a way to bring Asia together? And my answer to that question was almost, there was no impact from Islam. It was this, the kind of the apex of secularism and Arab socialism, and also thinking about Pakistan as not as an Islamic state as it would emerge later in the 70s, for example. And that's a really important historical point that I think that is often lost in this idea, post-colonial nation states bring Islam on. And in fact, no, not necessarily, even though Pakistan was an important point for self-determination. It really triggered many important conversations across the Muslim world or across Asia, regardless of religion.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for this. And I'm sure there is so much more to be said. We have next question from Italy. So you're being watched back home. Francesco Mazzucotelli, I hope I'm not butchering the name. Thank you for this stellar presentation. Could you elaborate on Islam and the religious dimensions of nationalism and whether this affected the mysticism legalism issue?
Oh, interesting. First of all, it's exciting to know that people in Italy are listening to this. So thank you for that. But so I think that we have a little bit of a chronological disconnect there, in the sense that this construction of mysticism as being more influential, and maybe I'm misunderstanding aspects of the question, but focusing on mysticism as an important element of the Islamization of Asia versus legalism was a colonial discourse. So that's one bit. I think that throughout the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th century, we see overlaps, and also before the 16th century, but focusing more on Eastern Asia, we see these overlaps and conversations between mysticism and legalism. When nationalism kind of kicks in the latter, in the early part of the 20th century, we see well, each country is different, but I'm thinking specifically maybe about British South Asia and Dutch East Indies, so Dutch Indonesia. These are kind of the two places I'm thinking of right now, in which mysticism kind of, okay, so Muslims who were active in the anti-colonial movement had soaked in and kind of appropriated and accepted this discourse over mysticism as a non-confrontational, non-political, non-legalistic approach to Islam. And so they thought, or they advanced an agenda of nationalism and anti-colonialism that was secular while retaining an Islamic identity as spiritual mysticism. Whereas individuals who were political leaders who were advocating for anti-colonial nationalist agenda and who relied on Islam as part of the discourse would have relied on a discourse on Islam that was legalistic and was really grounded on the 5 pillars, that was grounded on the need of being able to have a fully Muslim, fully Islamic life, and arguing that being in a colonial context was not allowing for that, because Muslims are now supposedly, according to certain interpretations, Muslims are now supposed to be ruled by non-Muslims. And so the colonial discourse that had polarized mysticism and legalism kind of comes through and emerges even more polarized during the anti-colonial nationalist movement. So I guess your question was not so confused. I was confused as I needed to process the question. So thank you. I hope this answered. This actually was a great point. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we only have maybe a few minutes left, and I'm not seeing any more questions from the audience. So what I do at the end is I usually ask my guest, the author, if there's anything else that you think is really important to mention that we didn't address in this conversation so far, maybe in a couple more minutes, just sort of to wrap it all up and to maybe highlight something that we didn't have a chance to talk about.
Right. I feel I've talked a lot, so it's hard to think that I haven't covered anything, but maybe just as a way of summing things or pulling some threads, to me, what the few points that were really important to bring home with the book were to kind of, first of all, again, shift the globe, like shift our perspective and having an Asia-centered perspective when we talk about Islam. And in that sense, thinking about the Middle East as West Asia allows for not excluding Arabia and the Middle East from this conversation, but rather to readjust it. And visually, Arabia would itself be a periphery, right? And the center would be somewhere in Afghanistan, probably. But instead, thinking without centers and peripheries, and thinking about the Ummah as an important both theological but also analytical lens, to see it as a space in which Muslims from the world over partake and contribute as equals in this shaping of Islam. And maybe the one thing that I would like to add is that, of course, my book is about Asia. I don't focus on Africa. I don't focus on the Americas. But I think that if I were to expand, if I ever had intellectual capability or graduate students or colleagues who wanted to expand on this, I would love to see this paradigm being further expanded or applied to different contexts in which, again, we do away with center and periphery, and we think about conversations that happen in moment of movement. And so when we take Islam not as a thing, because Islam is not an actor per se, right? It's Muslims. And so as Muslims carry Islam around the world, they establish conversations, whether they are verbal conversations or material conversation in creating new arts or new architecture, and taking this lens of conversations and exchanges when people move in creating, in adapting, adopting, and formulating other ways of being Muslim, in which there is no a golden standard. There's no golden standard. And so everybody's equally Muslim. And this is not a way to justify heresy. I mean, there is always inner community conversation on what is not negotiable. And these are conversations that have existed for the longest of times. But yeah, so this is, I guess this would be my parting thought. I would love to see this being further expanded and applied as a way of thinking about Islam and Muslims in other parts of the world.
Well, thank you so much. And I think that's a great place to end our conversation. Once again, everybody, this is the book. It's a fascinating book. Read it. It's going to open up new perspectives on thinking about Islam globally, Islam and Asia, within the Asian continent, and interconnections across the continent, but also outside the continent as well. So with that being said, Dr. Formichi, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. And everybody, please follow us on Twitter, on Facebook, on YouTube, and we're looking forward to future conversations. All the best.
Thanks for having me. Have a great day.
You too. Bye now.